Hey class, this week we're going to be talking about Chapter 11 and discussing some major sociological issues when it comes to race and ethnicity. Sociologists define race as representing superficial physical differences that a particular society considers significant. Race is said to be a social construct, meaning that there's no biological explanation for racial differences, and societies create and perpetuate their own conceptions of race, often in order to justify inequitable treatment based on racial divisions and social, political, and economic practices. Names for racial categories change over time. Race is a system of labeling people that creates and perpetuates a specific identity, and specific labels fall in and out of favor during different eras. So I'm going to go over just some examples of what the social construction of race means when it comes to kind of American definitions of race on the next couple slides here. So take the U.S. Census, for example. The first census in 1790 only had 3 racial categories listed: free whites, all other free persons, and slaves. So those were your 3 races according to the U.S. Census in 1790. Then in 1850, so 60 years later, the category mulatto was added to the census categories, and other multiracial categories were then included in subsequent census counts. Mulatto was a category from 1850 to 1890, and again in 1910 and 1920. Then octoroon and quadroon were categories in 1890. Definitions for these groups varied from census to census. In 1870, mulatto was defined as including quadroons, octoroons, and all persons having any perceptible trace of African blood. The instructions to census takers said that important scientific results depended on their including people in the right categories. In 1890, a mulatto was defined as someone with 3/8 to 5/8 black blood. A quadroon had 1/4 black blood, and an octoroon had 1/8 or any trace of black blood. The word, quote, Negro was added in 1900 to replace colored, and census officials noted that the new term was increasingly favored among members of the African race, quote. In 2000, African American was added to the census form. In 2013, the Bureau announced that because, quote, Negro was offensive to many, of course, the term would be dropped from the census forms and surveys. So just from this example, you can see how race has been socially constructed in the United States over time, especially when it comes to African Americans. What qualifies as an African American or a mulatto or a quadroon or an octoroon all really depends on how society is defining race, but also those definitions kind of carry some implications, of course, with them as well. And on the next slide, we'll look at Native Americans. So Native Americans were not even considered a racial category on the U.S. Census until 1860, when the term, quote, Indian was first included. Beginning in the year 2000, although only single race categories were offered, respondents were told they could mark more than one race to identify themselves. This was the first time that all Americans were offered the option to include themselves in more than one racial category. The 2010 census had 63 possible race categories, 6 for single races and 57 for combined races. So again, you can see how this kind of social construction of race has happened over the course of U.S. history. Native Americans who were living here before even white settlers got here were not even included on the census till 1860. And you can see the first year the census was taken, again, there were only 3 racial categories, and as of 2010, there were 63. So we added 60 different race categories in that time. So similar to race, it's also difficult to define ethnicity because it's also a social construct that changes over time and depends on what the society defines it as. So, however, we can loosely define ethnicity as a term that describes cultural practices, values, and beliefs that are shared by a group. Ethnicities can be based on common language, shared religion or rituals, cuisine, art, etc. So what makes a minority group a minority group? So any minority is a group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, so their racial or ethnic characteristics, are singled out from the others in society in which they live for differential and unequal treatment, and who therefore regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. Minority groups are also referred to as, quote, subordinate groups, while majority groups are the dominant groups when it comes to social power. However, keep in mind the term minority group does not necessarily mean that the group represents a numerical minority. Large groups of people can also be labeled as a minority group. For example, if you think about the era of apartheid in South Africa, white South Africans held all the social, economic, and political power despite the fact that they represented a numerical minority. In other words, it's not the number of people that comprise a racial or ethnic group that defines them as a minority group. It is the lack of power that is the predominant characteristic of a minority group. So generally, there are 5 characteristics that apply to minority groups. Number 1 is the unequal treatment and having less power over their lives than the dominant group does. Number 2 is distinguishing cultural or physical traits, so skin color, clothing, language. Number 3 is involuntary membership in a group. In other words, they were born that way. Number 4, awareness of subordination. So the group as a whole is kind of recognizes that there are commonalities between their experience in the society and being kind of subjugated by the dominant group as a whole. And number 5, there's a high rate of in-group marriage, meaning that people are not really marrying outside their ethnic or racial group. They're kind of staying insulated within their own cultural or racial category as society has defined it for them. So minority groups often fall to the social phenomenon of scapegoating, which is when a dominant group displaces its unfocused aggression onto a subordinate or minority group. When societies confront resource shortages or economic instability, minority groups are often singled out and blamed for the trials and tribulations that the society is confronting. For example, when Germany was losing its footing in terms of international power and influence, was facing an economic depression after World War I, and Hitler rose to power and, of course, became popular due to his philosophy and practice of blaming and persecuting people of Jewish descent, along with homosexuals, Catholics, and gypsies, of course. But really, Jewish people in Nazi Germany, of course, were scapegoated, and they were blamed for all the troubles that German society was encountering. In modern-day U.S. society, many politicians often blame Mexican immigrants, both legal and undocumented, for the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, as well as drug use in America, unemployment, and crime rates in the United States. Another recent example of scapegoating, which has, I believe, only just started, is kind of the scapegoating of the Chinese after the emergence of the novel coronavirus. So now that you have an idea of kind of general definition of race, ethnicity, and minority groups, we will focus for the next several slides on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So we'll start with stereotypes here on slide 8. So stereotypes are oversimplified generalizations about a group of people that do not take the individual into account. In other words, stereotypes enable people to see a person who is representative of a specific group based on their skin color, it could be their language, their cuisine, their rituals, religion, and judge them instantaneously based on their alignment with a specific group identity. Stereotypes can be based on race and ethnicity, but also gender, sexuality, age, and religion. Stereotypes can be positive. For example, women are stereotyped as good multitaskers. Asians are often stereotyped as very intelligent, but more often stereotypes carry negative connotations. For example, the assumption that darker-skinned people are bad or women are too emotional to take on leadership positions. Now, prejudice is defined as the beliefs, feelings, thoughts, and attitudes that someone holds about a group. Prejudices grow out of entrenched stereotypes. They're not rooted in personal experience, but represent prejudgments based on socially constructed narratives that have been promoted within society. So basically, stereotypes are these kind of oversimplified generalizations that over time become very prevalent in a society, and prejudice is when a certain individual kind of internalizes those stereotypes. So in 1968, there was a third grade school teacher. Her name was Jane Elliott. She was in Iowa, and she was motivated to construct this experiment to demonstrate prejudice called the brown eye, blue eye experiment. So this happened shortly after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and the school that she worked at had recently named MLK Jr. as their hero of the year. And when he was murdered, her third grade students were very confused. Why would our hero of the year be assassinated? They didn't understand. And so she wanted to put together an experiment to kind of demonstrate how racism and prejudice is very prevalent in our society, and how easy it can be kind of to fall into prejudicial thinking. So that's a little background. So in 1968, so Jane Elliott, she was, again, a third grade teacher and an anti-racism activist, performed a direct experiment with the students in her classroom. So they came into school one day, and she told her students that people with brown eyes were better than people with blue eyes. She also made the brown-eyed students put construction paper armbands on the blue-eyed students to kind of physically set them apart from their classmates. Throughout the school day, Mrs. Elliott continuously reinforced the message that brown-eyed students were better than blue-eyed students. The brown-eyed children, over time throughout the day, began to act aggressively and were progressively more and more mean toward the blue-eyed children. She even noticed that the blue-eyed children, their kind of performance and their schoolwork and their scores on their schoolwork was suffering because of kind of all the discrimination they were experiencing. And after the experiment, at the end of the day, she kind of sat down all the children and explained the experiment to them so that they would understand the purpose of what she was trying to communicate. So the blue-eyed children, when she talked to them afterward, expressed that they felt discriminated against by the other brown-eyed students, and that their attitude toward them was blatantly unfair and not based on anything grounded in reality. The purpose of her experiment was to demonstrate that a difference as simple as eye color, a difference defined and established by the authority figure, being Miss Elliott, created a rift between the students almost immediately. And her experiment shows how easily people can fall into prejudicial thinking and discriminatory actions. So, and I have a quote from Mrs. Elliott up here. It says, "You are not born racist, you are born into a racist society. And like anything else, if you can learn it, you can unlearn it. But some people choose not to unlearn it because they're afraid they'll lose power if they share with other people. We're afraid of sharing power. That's what it's all about." Now on this slide, and you can also find a link to this video on Blackboard under the Chapter 11 content link. So this video contains footage from Jane Elliott's 1968 experiment. I do want to kind of put a disclaimer out there. Be aware that this video contains some sensitive language. Keep in mind the time period during which this experiment was being filmed, 1968. Some of the language that the students use to talk about African Americans is certainly no one would talk this way now, but unfortunately it is reflective of the terms used during that time period. But the fact that these small children are using some of these racial slurs at such a young age, and during this kind of heightened civil rights period in American history, it also, the fact that they use these words demonstrates the extent to which kind of prejudices are really learned behaviors. Because none of these children, were born and automatically felt certain ways about another race. They were taught to think a certain way. So the terms used by these young students, it illustrates again how pervasive stereotypes and prejudice can be in a society that sets certain social groups in opposition to others, and how deeply ingrained these ways of thinking can be communicated to children early on in their lives. So I hope y'all will watch the experiment. And I think this video is about 15 minutes. And it's narrated by actually Philip Zimbardo, if you remember him from the Stanford prison experiment. Now, a very well-known sociologist, the first African-American sociologist, well-renowned, W.E.B. Du Bois. I included a quote from him on the top. It says, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea." So we're going to move kind of beyond prejudice to racism and institutional racism and colorism here. So racism is defined as a stronger type of prejudice used to justify the belief that one racial category is somehow superior or inferior to others. Going a step further, institutional racism is defined as the way in which racism becomes embedded in the fabric of society. For example, racism against non-white individuals led to slavery in the United States, which was undergirded and reinforced by legislation, meaning an institutional kind of undergirding of the practice. Another example is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, wherein the U.S. government relocated Japanese American citizens to internment camps due to government-backed discriminatory practices after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Today, some may say that kind of the undocumented Mexican immigrants who have been put into essentially prison camps in the past several years could also be an example of institutional racism. So colorism is the next step, and that's another kind of prejudice in which a person believes that one type of skin tone is superior or inferior to another within a racial group. So for example, in Indian society, skin bleaching is a common practice because lighter-skinned Indians are associated with a higher social status than darker-skinned individuals. So on this slide, I have a link to the Harvard University Implicit Bias Quiz. I encourage you all to take the quiz. It'll take you about 10 minutes. So you click on that link, or on Blackboard, if you click into Chapter 11, you'll see the link right at the top. So once you've clicked the link, first it'll ask you for your approval, because when you do take it, Harvard is analyzing, the information that you are putting in there. It's a study that they do. So first if you choose to agree to it, you'll agree to it. And then it'll take you to a page where there's several different tests that come up. And I just want you all to look for the link to the race IAT. And IAT means implicit association test. So look for the one that says race. And then click on that quiz. And it'll take you, it's pretty quick. And this quiz will shed light on your implicit biases and prejudices when it comes to race and skin color. Many of us in the U.S. believe that we live in a post-racial society since the civil rights achievements made in the middle of the 20th century. Of course, the recent kind of uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement this year has kind of questioned that assumption of the post-racial society, but of course, kind of that movement itself has brought to life kind of these other divisions in society where there's kind of a debate in terms of how how racist, how institutionally racist our society is at this moment in time. Even considering as far as we've come, still a long way to go, to paraphrase MLK. So, however, most of us still carry subconscious racial and ethnic biases, even if we don't think that we do. So this quiz is developed by Harvard University's Implicit Project, and the quiz is composed of 7 different components that you will quickly assess, photographs and words, based on the answers of black, white, good, or bad. The quiz results might surprise you. You should answer the quiz questions as quickly as you possibly can, and it really shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes to complete it. While prejudice refers to biased thinking, discrimination consists of actions against a people. Discrimination based on race or ethnicity can take many forms, from unfair housing practices. For example, there's a practice referred to as racial steering, which is a practice where real estate agents will direct prospective home buyers toward or away from certain neighborhoods based on their race. So there was another recent study done on kind of racial steering where they had a white family and an African American family, very similar like occupations and educational background and income and wealth. So they were very similar families, the only real difference being the skin color. And they went to the same real estate agency, and turned out the real estate agency was showing these 2 families very different houses in different neighborhoods. And when the African American family inquired about a house that the white family was showed, the real estate agent told them that the house was no longer on the market when in fact it was. So discrimination based on race within even real estate practices is still evident in the United States. Other examples of discrimination are biased hiring practices, to overt discriminatory legislation such as the Jim Crow laws in the United States, which of course upheld the government-enforced segregation of Black Americans from white Americans at state and government-run facilities. Discrimination does not just disappear by enacting laws to abolish it, unfortunately. Prejudice and discrimination are complex societal ills that really permeate criminal justice, educational, economic, and political systems. And discrimination and prejudice takes a long time to combat. Institutional discrimination occurs when a societal system has developed with and perpetuates the embedded disenfranchisement of a group. So another example of what institutional discrimination could be, kind of beyond the Jim Crow laws. Another example would be like the U.S. military policy of don't ask, don't tell, which came about during the Clinton administration. And it's a new rule for the military where you were allowed to be homosexual, but you couldn't tell anyone. And but if you did tell someone, or you did make it evident your sexual preference, then you might be kicked out. Now, white privilege is the result of institutional prejudice against non-white minority groups. It describes the numerous benefits that white people receive simply by being born into part of the dominant group. So I have a link here to a documentary called White People. It was produced by MTV a few years ago. And this documentary interviews young white Americans and delves into issues of white privilege in the United States and uncovers the many ways in which white Americans are unaware of the struggles that other people and communities in the U.S. endure on a daily basis. So again, of course, the recent Black Lives Matter movement has kind of brought a lot of this to light and brought white privilege to light as well. For instance, an example of white privilege is being able to walk down the street with a bottle of soda and a pack of Skittles while wearing a hoodie and not having to be afraid that you might be murdered, possibly by a police officer or a vigilante on your way home. So that's an example of white privilege, or going into a store and not worrying that you're being watched as a potential shoplifter or being targeted in that way. The Black Lives Matter movement recently also has kind of brought this white privilege to light in the protests, when you would see the kind of white allies of the movement would go toward the front of the protest line in order to kind of make a wall of privilege to protect their Black compatriots from being, shot with a rubber bullet or tear gassed. So it was kind of an effort to kind of use that white privilege in order to help the protest movement. So a culture of prejudice can be defined as when a prejudice is embedded within our culture, often so deeply embedded that it continues to occur without our recognition because it has become so normalized. It's a form of social repression sustained through fear and ignorance. We grow up surrounded by images, stereotypes, and casual expressions of racism and prejudice that reinforce certain ideas about minority groups. So let me get my little marker here. So on these pictures, I have, this is an old advertisement for Aunt Jemima's pancake flour. You can see the image has changed over time. This is an early image, but it's not really an idyllic encapsulation or illustration of African American women, of course. Then here I have the Chiquita banana. There's kind of a culture of prejudice in the United States of kind of over-sexualizing Latino women. And the Chiquita banana has been kind of criticized for kind of representing that prejudice or stereotype. Then, of course, Uncle Ben's rice, kind of this picture of the African American servant with the bow tie. And then, of course, it's been in the news recently, the Washington Redskins, which is now going to be renamed in light of kind of the recent upsurge in kind of recognition of our institutional racism in this country. And then down here, there's a little cartoon. It says, so there's all these people of different races at this counter, and the employee is saying, "Joe, these people say they want flesh-colored Band-Aids." So it's kind of pointing out that Band-Aids, they're kind of made for white people. the color of them. And yet it's supposed to blend into your flesh. But what if you are not a white person? That's not blending into your flesh. So I actually did see recently that Band-Aid is going to be coming out with different colored products pretty soon. So we're working in the right direction, but again, working your way out of institutional racism and prejudices takes a long time, and just changing the name of the Washington Redskins or changing a logo on our pancake flour, it's indicative of something great that might be happening, but things do take time. And as you've seen, I'm sure there's been quite a lot of backlash to kind of this recent recognition of our culture of prejudice that has come to light. So intergroup relations, we're going to focus on these in the next several slides here. Intergroup relations range along a spectrum between tolerance and intolerance. And over the next few slides, we'll cover the 6 different categories. So we'll start with pluralism, which is the most tolerant intergroup relation. And this is a society in which no distinction is made between groups. And so no distinctions made between people of different racial or ethnic groups. Within pluralism, there's a great mixture of different cultures where each culture retains its own identity and yet adds flavor to the whole. So if you've ever heard the metaphor of the salad bowl society, where all the flavors and the ingredients of the salad come together to create a delicious combination of ingredients that complement each other and create a delicious salad meal. So within pluralism, there's a mutual respect on the part of all cultures and creating a multicultural environment of acceptance. So the next category is assimilation. Assimilation is the second most tolerant category, and it represents the process by which a minority, individual, or group gives up its own identity and traditions by conforming to and taking on the characteristics of the dominant culture. Immigrants moving to a new land or nation often try to assimilate as much as possible so they can, quote, fit in with others in their new society. They may adopt a new religion, learn a new language, or start to dress differently in order to assimilate. Early on in the 20th century, there were a lot of campaigns across the United States to encourage assimilation of Native Americans into mainstream American society. And as you can see in this picture on the bottom right, Native American youths were sent to re-education schools and were given makeovers, including new clothing, new haircuts that reflected white American norms of dress and appearance. Native Americans were strongly encouraged to leave behind their ancestral traditions, speak English and change their religious beliefs in order to accept the Christian worldview. So you can see in this picture, just to demonstrate assimilation. Of course, this was forced assimilation, but these are the same 3 Native American boys in the before picture when they arrived, and the after picture with their haircuts and their little suits and their leather shoes, short hair. So they were kind of altered and changed in order to fit in and assimilate with kind of the mainstream white society. The third most tolerant category of intergroup relations is amalgamation, which describes the process by which a minority group and a majority group combine to form a new group. And this is achieved by way of allowing intermarriage between individuals of different racial and ethnic groups. So for example, of course, in the United States, it was illegal to marry someone of a different race for quite a long period of our history. And if not illegal, it was pretty strongly looked down upon in terms of social norms. So in 1967, the United States Supreme Court struck down laws banning interracial marriage as a result of the landmark case Loving versus Virginia. And I'd like y'all to watch the video that's on this slide. 6 minutes long, so it's very short, brief. And you can, again, also find this on Blackboard under the Chapter 11 content folder. So this video reflects on the famous Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court case that allowed interracial marriage and amalgamation within U.S. society. And this video is being filmed 50 years after the ruling that legalized marriage between men and women of different races. And it interviews several different interracial couples and asks them kind of about their experiences and how their lives and their relationships have been affected by this Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia. The fourth category of intergroup relations is segregation, meaning the physical separation of two groups, particularly in residence, but also in workplace and social functions. So there's two forms of segregation that we're going to focus on here. It's de jure segregation and de facto. So de jure segregation, it's enforced by the law. For example, apartheid South Africa and the U.S. Jim Crow laws. These were forms of segregation that were undergirded by the jurisdiction of the nation or different states. So these were types of segregation that were actually written out and enforced by our state, our police, and our law enforcement. On the other hand, we have de facto segregation. De facto segregation is enforced by custom, and it cannot simply be abolished by a court mandate. So for instance, even after U.S. Jim Crow laws were kind of dismantled and ruled as unconstitutional, so de jure segregation was no longer undergirded by U.S. law, we still, of course, saw that de facto segregation continued, because to really change the hearts and minds of people living their lives day to day, sometimes just passing a law in a law book or in a courtroom is not just going to automatically change all the people and the norms and the customs that they've become used to. So de facto segregation can kind of lag a bit behind de jure segregation in terms of getting rid of it. And then I have this picture down here, this map here, just to kind of illustrate de facto segregation. So this map is from 2010, so obviously no more de jure segregation at this point in time. However, this is a map of Atlanta, and you can see the area that is shaded more in green represents where Black people kind of seem to be residing in the Atlanta area. Then the area in red is where your Asian immigrants or Asian Americans are living. And that's kind of right here in the center, a little bit on the outskirts. And then the area shaded in blue, which is kind of this whole area, is where most of your white people in Atlanta are living. So you can see, even though de jure segregation no longer exists and has been kind of ruled unconstitutional, de facto segregation still is in effect in the United States. And kind of this map of Atlanta from 2010 and where different racial categories tend to live kind of shows that de facto segregation is still quite alive and well. And then our fifth category of intergroup relations is expulsion. This is when a subordinate group is forced by a dominant group to leave a certain area or country, usually on the basis of race or ethnicity. One prominent example is the Trail of Tears in the United States in the 19th century, when Native Americans were forcefully relocated from their homelands, majority of which passed away during the journey. Another example of expulsion is the implementation of the Japanese American internment camps under the FDR administration, which forcefully relocated anyone with at least 1/8 Japanese ancestry to internment camps in the US. And a current example is the expulsion of the minority group called the Kurds from several different Middle Eastern nations. And the Kurds live now at the outskirts of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Now, the final and most toxic intergroup relation is genocide. Genocide represents and describes the deliberate annihilation of a targeted, usually subordinate group. Hitler's, quote, final solution to exterminate all Jewish people, as well as Catholics, people with disabilities, and homosexuals, is a prime example of genocide. However, genocide continues into the present day in the 21st century, such as in Darfur in Sudan, where 500,000 people of Darfuri descent have been deliberately exterminated by government-funded militia groups. The genocide in Darfur is the result of many years of competition and civil wars between people in the Sudan over what groups do and what groups do not have a right to natural resources and land rights, following their independence from British rule in the middle of the 20th century. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Darfur, it used to be heavily covered in the news and the media, yet has kind of fallen to the wayside recently, although this genocide is still ongoing. So I've put there's a Vice special that they did on Darfur and the civil war there and the resultant genocide. And if you'd like to watch it, it's about 15 minutes. The video linked to here started about halfway through because they cover two different topics in the video. So if you started around minute 15, you will see the second half where they cover the genocide in Darfur. And if you look at this picture up on the top, the map in the upper right, you'll see the estimated genocide totals from 1900 to 2005. And you can see most of this genocide during this time period has happened in the Soviet Union, USSR, China, Japan, Indonesia, several countries in Africa: Nigeria, Algeria, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Namibia, Germany, of course, the Nazi extermination, and in South America as well, Guatemala, Chile, and Argentina, and El Salvador. So for the remainder of the lecture, we're going to look at different minority groups in the United States, racial or ethnic minority groups, and just kind of do a little bit of a historical recap on each one, and then look at kind of the present day situation for each one as well. So we're going to start with Native Americans on these first few slides here. So Native Americans, they're the only non-immigrant ethnic group in the United States. Of course, because they were here when the white settlers arrived. So they make up less than 1% of the U.S. population today. They're sometimes referred to as, quote, Indians or, quote, American Indians, due to a misnomer applied by Christopher Columbus when he assumed he had landed in India. During the 1800s and the early 1900s, 30,000 Native American children were forcefully placed into Indian boarding schools run by Christian missionaries and the U.S. government. Again, if you think back to that slide where we talked about the assimilation and the picture of the 3 Native American boys who were kind of given American makeovers, white American makeovers. So at these Indian boarding schools, they were removed from their families and their indigenous culture. They were forced to cut their hair, learn to speak English, and practice Christianity. And the ultimate goal was to, quote, civilize the savages. So the following laws have dramatically affected the lives of Native Americans. First, we have the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this forced the relocation of all Native tribes east of the Mississippi River, thus leading to the Trail of Tears that we talked about on the expulsion slide. Number 2 is the Indian Appropriations Act. This was passed in the 1800s and funded further removals of Native Americans from their lands. No Indian tribe could be recognized as an independent nation with which the U.S. had to make treaties. Then in 1887, we have the passage of the Dawes Act. This reversed the policy of isolating Native Americans on reservations. Instead, they were forced onto properties with white settlers in an attempt to reduce their power and solidarity as a group. Then we had the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which guaranteed the Bill of Rights to Native Americans. Then in 1975, had the Indian Self-Determination Act, which gave tribes more power over their land and sovereignty, and stated that the U.S. government had to honor treaties made with Native American tribes. Unfortunately, Native Americans still suffer the effects of centuries of persecution. Drug abuse among teens is highest among Native American youth, which you can see in this graph here. Native American youth often do poorly on standardized tests in comparison with other racial and ethnic groups. Native Americans have the highest rate of suicide for the age group 18 to 24 compared with other races and ethnicities. And Native Americans experience more poverty than any other racial or ethnic group in the country. Now, on the next few slides, we will focus kind of on the history and current state of African Americans in U.S. society. So, of course, the ancestors of African Americans did not come to the United States willfully or by choice. The first Africans were transported to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 to be sold as indentured servants. And by 1705, Virginia passed slave codes that any foreign-born non-Christian could be owned as a slave and would be considered the personal property of the slave owner. By 1869, there was a highly developed slave trade within the United States. And during this dark time in U.S. history, whippings, executions, rape, and the denial of health care and education for slaves was permissible and enforced by law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, giving Black men the right to vote. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So currently, African Americans make up about 14 to 15% of the U.S. population today. According to the National Urban League's Equality Index, based on variables like economics, health, education, social justice, and civic engagement, African Americans are still falling about 28% behind in terms of equality with white Americans. Prejudice and discrimination against African Americans continues today, which has really been brought to light by the recent second wave of Black Lives Matter protests, despite the progress that has been made toward equality. Many cities across the country are still somewhat segregated along racial lines. Again, remember we talked about de jure segregation and de facto segregation. So if we look at this photo here on the right, this is the 2010 census map of Columbus, Georgia. And you'll see the red dots up in the north represent where most of the white population lives in Columbus. Mostly up here, a little bit down south. And the blue dots on the map represent where African American families live in Columbus. So you can see, even though, of course, de jure segregation has been outlawed, de facto segregation is certainly still alive and well in Columbus, Georgia, with predominantly whites living in the north and African Americans living in the south. In addition, as we've been talking about a lot in the media and culture and the news, Black Americans are more likely to be pulled over. We're going to look at this center graph right here. So Black Americans are more likely to be pulled over by the police than white Americans, and twice as likely to be arrested during a traffic stop. And we'll look at this graphic over here on the left. Those surveys of illicit drug use in the United States show that white Americans use illicit drugs at a higher rate than Black Americans. Black Americans are sentenced and imprisoned for drug offenses at a much higher rate than white Americans. 1 out of every 3 African American men will spend time in prison during their lifetime. That's right here. While only 1 out of every 17 white men will go to prison during their lifetime. So even though we certainly have made progress since the slave trade, incrementally over time, obviously there are still deeply entrenched kind of institutional and cultural impediments to achieving full equality between African Americans and all other races in the United States. So clearly a long way to go, which the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly brought to life and kind of made into much more salient conversation that's being had in the United States currently. So again, the Black Lives Matter movement is bringing a lot of these unjust practices to light, inspired by the numerous deaths and arrests of African Americans occurring in the hands of law enforcement. And not just law enforcement, also kind of like vigilante citizens. So I have this graph up here on the upper left that shows, and this was created during like the first wave of Black Lives Matter, which occurred in 2015. So in 2015, unarmed Black people were killed by police at 5 times the rate of unarmed whites. And you can see the red graph here represents African Americans. The kind of orange represents Hispanics being killed by the police, and the blue is representative of whites being killed by the police in 2015. And of course, during this first wave of Black Lives Matter that happened in 2015, really sparked by Trayvon Martin case, was it just really set everyone off, because it was just this child with Skittles and a soda who was murdered walking home from the store. And yet we continue to see kind of these similar stories acting themselves out over time. And certainly the cell phone and cell phone camera has really brought to life a lot of kind of these daily struggles that African Americans and Black Americans face on a daily basis. And kind of this constant kind of anxiety or fear, or just this constant need to be aware of who's watching you and who's around and how are they viewing you. And so Black Lives Matter has really brought to life kind of these issues of white privilege and institutionalized racism and de facto segregation, and all of these things that we've been talking about in this lecture have really been amplified by this movement. And of course, Obama, during when he was still in office and during the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests, made a speech and was reflecting on what's happening in our country, and said that this could have been his son. And we will we'll be returning to talk a lot more about the Black Lives Matter protests in chapter 21 when we talk about social movements and social change as well. So now we're going to turn toward Asian Americans. So the category of Asian Americans spans a great diversity of backgrounds and cultures. Asian Americans compose about 5.3% of the U.S. population. During the 1850s, the first wave of Asian immigrants came to the United States from China. They were mostly Chinese men looking for work in the American West in order to send money back home to their families. Many white Americans at that time scapegoated the Chinese immigrant population and blamed Chinese men for falling wages and economic troubles. Thus, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed and restricted the immigration of people of Chinese descent to the country. Though these restrictions were eased over time, in 1965, the Immigration and Nationalist Act put into effect a 10-year stop to Chinese immigration, as white workers were blaming Chinese immigrants for stealing their jobs. During the 1880s, immigrants from Japan began to travel to the United States. Most were moving to Hawaii to work in the sugar trade or to California to work in agriculture. Unlike the Chinese immigrants before them, Japanese immigrants were moving here with their families. In 1913, the California Alien Land Law was passed, and this restricted Japanese immigrants from ownership and long-term leases of agricultural land. From 1942 to 1946, Japanese Americans were forcefully transported and relocated to internment camps due to World War II concerns that some of the Japanese American population were spies for Japan. And in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a large influx of immigrants from Korea and Vietnam arrived in the U.S. Korean immigration was gradual, and their numbers grew steadily over time. Vietnamese immigration occurred primarily after 1975, when restrictive communist policies were out in effect in Vietnam, causing many in the country to flee. So in 1980, the U.S. passed the Refugee Act in order to make it easier for Vietnamese people and families to come to the U.S. as official political refugees. So today, Asian Americans earn the highest wages and salaries among all racial ethnic groups in the United States. And we can see that on this center graph right here. So it's showing earnings of women and men. And you can look at, this is the white category and the Asian category. And you can see on average, Asian men make about $1,000 and $1,055 a week on average, and the average white man makes $879. And in addition, Asian American women make more than any other racial category of women, making about $770 a week, whereas your average white American makes about $710 a week. Then we will look at the graduation rates. Down here at the bottom, Asian American youth have the highest rates of graduation from college, and Asian American children have the lowest rates of poverty. So you can see that on this bottom one, what percentage of groups are graduating with their bachelor's degree. 60.1% of Asian Americans, 40.4% of white Americans, 20.5% of Black Americans, and 15.7% of Hispanic Americans are graduating with their bachelor's degree. And in terms of children in poverty by race, we have 39% of African American children live in poverty, 37% of Native American children, 33% Hispanic American children. And then we can look down here and see Asian Americans and white Americans have the same rate of children in poverty, which is 14%. but less than half, significantly less than half of the amount of African American children in poverty. And then we'll look at these last two graphs here in the bamboo ceiling, looking at who's working in kind of these high-paying tech jobs. The blue represents white Americans, this kind of burgundy represents Asian Americans, and then Black and Hispanic Americans in that kind of peach color. So certainly white Americans are very prevalent in the high-paying tech jobs, but Asian Americans certainly have a large chunk of that as well. And then of course this year, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused an uptick in violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans due to, again, scapegoating of Asian peoples and the label of the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus being applied to the novel coronavirus by a lot of our media and political leaders. So like Asian Americans, the term Hispanic Americans also spans a very wide variety of backgrounds and nationalities. Other terms used to define this group are, quote, Latino Americans, or more recently, the term Latinx has come to popularity. The Hispanic American population composes about 17% of the U.S. population, and most of this population, 75%, comes from Mexico, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Mexican immigration to the United States began in the early 1900s as Mexican citizens began moving to the U.S. to work in agriculture. Mexican immigration was often circular, as immigrants would move back and forth between the U.S. and Mexico based on the agricultural seasons. During the 1940s and 1950s, the U.S. government implemented the federal Bracero program, which offered protection to Mexican guest workers. However, social concerns and scapegoating, again, against Mexican laborers for economic ills in the country led to the enactment of Operation Wetback in 1954, which led to the deportation of thousands of illegal Mexican workers. In 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act instituted strengthened border protections along the U.S.-Mexico border. Deportations, imprisonment, and hate crimes against Mexican immigrants, legal and illegal, continue today. These practices are rooted in economic and social anxieties in some groups within the United States. And of course, recently, not only Mexican, but many Latin American, Hispanic, Latinx people have been put into these kind of refugee prison camps along the border. And though we heard a lot about them about a year or two ago, a lot of these people are still in these prison camps. A lot of children separated from their families and their parents or whoever they originally came here with, and are still kind of sitting in cages in prison camps along our border. So certainly kind of scapegoating and prejudice against especially Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants are alive and well today. So we'll focus on Cuban immigrants here on this slide. The first major wave of Cuban immigration to the U.S. began in 1959. Cuban Cuban Americans are the second largest Hispanic American subgroup behind Mexicans. When Fidel Castro took power after ousting President Batista, many of the wealthy and educated people from Cuba fled to the United States, were given refugee status, offered protection, and social services. Over the next 3 decades, refugees from Cuba continued to escape and travel by boat to Florida. In 1994, Castro declared that any Cuban that wanted to leave communist Cuba was free to do so. 1 year later, the U.S. set out the Cuban Migration Agreement, which restricted legal immigration from Cuba. A huge influx of Cuban refugees came by boat to the U.S., and the U.S. government instituted the wet foot, dry foot policy, which meant that if Cuban refugees made it to American soil, they could stay in the U.S., but if the Coast Guard or U.S. authorities apprehended their boat before hitting land, they would be sent back to Cuba. In 2014, President Obama announced the normalization of relations with Cuba, the easing of sanctions, allowing for trade with, foreign investment in, and travel to Cuba. But in 2017, President Trump announced the reinstatement of restrictions on travel, trade, and investment with Cuba, though he did not reverse the lifted sanctions. So Cuban Americans can still travel to and send money to Cuba, and the embassies in Havana and Washington remain open. And on this slide, just compares the assimilation of the largest immigrant groups in the United States. In particular here, we're talking about the Latinx groups here, so we're just going to look at, in particular, Cuba versus Mexico in terms of assimilation to U.S. society and culture. And so you can see different groups assimilate better or worse into U.S. society. And it seems that Cuban immigrants and Cuban Americans have assimilated quite well, while Mexican immigrants have one of the lowest assimilation rates on this graph. And lastly, we'll take a look at Arab Americans. Again, like everything else, the term Arab Americans spans a very wide variety of peoples from different countries and cultures. Though the land area known as Arabia has not existed for centuries, the Arab region spans the Middle East and Northern Africa. Despite the stereotype that all Arab people practice Islam, not all Arabs are Muslim, and not all Muslims are Arab. Since 1965, Arab immigration to the U.S. has been fairly steady. From 1990 to 2016, the Arab American population grew from 850,000 to almost 2 million. More than half of that population is composed of immigrants from Syria, Lebanon, and Jordanian Christians that came here as refugees. Generally, most Arab Americans are very highly educated and came here looking for better opportunities, less oppression for their families, or seeking an escape from political turmoil. During the 1970s, a sense of mistrust for Arab Americans developed due to the land claims and conflicts between Israel and Palestine. The U.S. government has close ties and support for Israel and its legitimacy as a state. The terrorist attacks of 9/11, of course, introduced a strong anti-Arab sentiment in the United States. Hundreds of hate crimes were committed against Arab and Muslim people across the U.S. during the months after the attacks. Many Muslims and Arab Americans were placed on no-fly lists and underwent intensive security screenings at airports. Islamophobia spread across our country, which is the irrational hatred of and/or fear of Muslims. In 2015, hate crimes against Muslim Americans rose by 78%. There's a link to a documentary on the bottom of this slide. It's about an hour long, so this one's a little bit longer than the usual videos I put in here. But it delves into kind of the day-to-day experiences of Muslim Americans after 9/11. I recommend watching at least half of it, maybe the beginning to about 30 minutes in. But similar to what I was talking about when we talk about African Americans in this country and when we reflect on white privilege, I think it's important to kind of see the day-to-day experience of all minority groups in America, and kind of hear it from their own mouths, in their own words, about how they feel about kind of the fear and anxieties that they have to go through every day based on prejudicial, racist ideas, beliefs, feelings that come from the dominant groups in society. So I hope you'll watch that one. That is the end of this week's lecture on race and ethnicity in the United States. Certainly this lecture alone in this topic could be an entire semester worth of material and then some to go over, but I hope y'all got a little bit of a broad idea of the history of racism in the United States, kind of where we are now, and kind of the different subgroups that we have in the United States, different racial categories, and also hopefully those first few slides where I talked about kind of this shifting definitions of races in U.S. society since the census was put into effect, hopefully opened your eyes to kind of the social construction of race and the fact that the racial categories that we create and maintain and perpetuate every day in the United States, they serve some people and they disempower others. And just being able to confront that fact and accept it is necessary if we're ever to truly achieve the equality that our country professes to strive for. So I hope y'all got a little bit something from this lecture. And again, we'll return back to some of the struggles and movements that African Americans and Native Americans in particular have been pushing for and struggling for when we return to some of these topics in Chapter 21 when we talk about social movements and social change. All right, I hope you all have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.